I arrived at the Lake Superior Ferry Terminal in Houghton, Michigan on March 3rd, when the ice was finally breaking. The sound of it, great sheets cracking and groaning against the pilings, reminded me of bones settling. I tried not to think about bones. My name is Sarah Kellerman, I'm 28 years old, and 6 months ago I lost everything that mattered when my fiancé drowned in a boating accident I still can't remember clearly. The Coast Guard Review Board was professional, even sympathetic, but the outcome was the same. My maritime certification was suspended pending psychiatric evaluation. They used words like trauma response and dissociative episode. What they meant was that I'd been at the wheel when Michael went overboard, and I couldn't explain the 47 minutes between his disappearance and my distress call. The nightmares started 2 weeks after his funeral. Always the same: dark water, Michael's voice calling from depths that shouldn't exist in a recreational boating area, and my hands on a wheel that wouldn't respond. I'd wake up tasting lake water, my pillows soaked with something that wasn't quite tears. I needed to work. More than that, I needed to be on the water again to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid, that I could function, that the psychiatric evaluation was just a formality. The Manitou's Crossing was hiring for the off-season route between Michigan's Upper Peninsula and Isle Royale, a skeletal crew for supply runs and the occasional winter researcher transport. They weren't particular about certifications for temporary deck work. They were even less particular about asking questions. Captain Hendricks met me in the terminal's crew office, a cramped room that smelled of burnt coffee and diesel fuel. She was a woman in her 60s with hair the color of salt and eyes that never quite met mine directly. Her handshake was firm but brief, her fingers calloused in patterns I recognized from years of rope work. "You've got maritime experience," she said. It wasn't a question. She was reading my resume, but her tone suggested she already knew everything on it. 4 years on charter vessels in the Pacific Northwest. Safety certifications, navigation training, passenger services. I didn't mention the gap in my employment history. She didn't ask. "Lake Superior isn't the Pacific," she said, setting down my paperwork. "The ocean is dangerous because it's vast. The lake is dangerous because it's deep and it doesn't forget." She pulled a laminated card from her desk drawer and slid it across to me. "These are the rules. Every crew member carries them. You'll memorize them before your first crossing." I picked up the card. It was worn at the edges, the lamination yellowing with age. 15 rules were printed in small, precise text. During dead calm, do not look over the railing. Do not respond to anything you hear. Do not leave your station until the fog clears. Never bring personal photographs on board. Never look directly at passengers who board without luggage. If the ship's bell rings on its own, count the chimes. If it reaches 13, proceed immediately to the bridge. Do not enter the engine room alone after sunset. If you see a passenger you don't remember boarding, do not ask them questions. Do not tell other crew members. Never whistle on deck after dark. If you hear singing beneath the deck at night, plug your ears immediately. Do not retrieve anything that falls overboard regardless of its value. If your compass spins counterclockwise, stay exactly where you are until it stops. Never acknowledge anyone who calls your name in a voice you recognize unless you can see them. Do not look at the water between midnight and 3 a.m. If you find wet footprints leading nowhere, do not follow them backward. If you encounter people in the water after dark, do not deviate course for rescue. Radio Coast Guard and continue. Never ask Captain Hendricks about the scar on her throat. I read through them twice, then looked up at Captain Hendricks with what I hoped was a professional expression. Inside, I was calculating whether this was some elaborate hazing ritual or if I'd just signed on with a crew that took maritime superstitions to an uncomfortable extreme. "These are traditional?" I asked carefully. "These are survival," she replied. Her eyes met mine for the first time, and I saw something in them that made my prepared smile falter. It wasn't humor or theatrical solemnity, it was exhaustion. The kind that comes from watching something terrible happen over and over again and being powerless to stop it. "We leave at I-600 tomorrow," she continued. "Orientation is at 5:30. Don't be late and don't lose that card." She stood, indicating the meeting was over. As I reached the door, she spoke again. "Miss Kellerman, the lake is particular about debts. If you owe it something, it will collect. The rules are the only reason any of us are still here to have this conversation." I nodded, not trusting myself to respond, and left the office with the laminated card heavy in my pocket. That night, in the crew quarters of the terminal building, I read through the rules again before sleeping. They seemed like the kind of thing someone would invent to scare new workers. Creepy enough to be unsettling, specific enough to sound authentic. I'd worked on vessels where veterans told stories about ghost ships and cursed waters. It was tradition, nothing more. I fell asleep with the card on my nightstand, and for the first time in 6 months, I didn't dream of Michael drowning. I dreamed instead of something vast and patient, waiting in water so deep that light had never touched it, counting every ship that passed above like a creditor reviewing accounts. The Manitou's crossing was older than I'd expected. A sturdy vessel built in the 1980s, retrofitted multiple times, her hull scarred with the kind of wear that comes from decades of service in brutal conditions. She could carry 40 passengers comfortably, though Captain Hendricks told me they rarely had more than a dozen during the off-season runs. My first crossing was uneventful, almost boring. We transported 7 passengers, university researchers heading to Isle Royale for early spring wildlife surveys, and 3 pallets of supplies. The lake was choppy but manageable, the sky a uniform gray that made the water look like hammered pewter. I performed routine deck inspections, checked safety equipment, and helped passengers with luggage. Standard maritime work that felt comfortingly familiar. It was the second crossing, 2 days later, when I first understood that the rules weren't tradition. We had 4 passengers scheduled. Dr. Marcus Webb, a geology professor I recognized from the first crossing, returning to the mainland. 2 maintenance workers from the Isle Royale facilities, and an elderly woman who boarded at the last minute as we were preparing to cast off. I was on the gangway performing final passenger checks when she arrived. She wore a vintage coat, the kind from the 1940s with a fur collar and buttons made of horn, and carried no luggage at all, not even a purse. She moved with surprising speed for someone who looked to be in her 80s, her feet making no sound on the metal gangway. "Welcome aboard," I said automatically, reaching for my passenger manifest. "I'll need to see your ticket and ID, please." She smiled at me. Her teeth were very white. That's when I made my mistake. I looked directly at her face. Rule number 3. Never look directly at passengers who board without luggage. The temperature dropped, not gradually, instantly, as if I'd opened a freezer door. My breath misted in the air between us, and the spray from the lake that had been hitting my face all morning suddenly felt like ice crystals. The woman's coat remained completely dry despite the water. Her skin had the waxy quality of something preserved rather than something living. And her eyes were wrong. From lid to lid, they were completely black. Not the pupil, not the iris, but the entire visible eye, like holes filled with deep water. When she smiled wider, I saw too many teeth. Far more than should fit in a human mouth, arranged in rows that receded into her throat. I blinked, stumbling backward, and when my eyes opened again, she was normal. Brown eyes, age-spotted skin, weathered hands clutching a leather purse that I would have sworn wasn't there a moment before. She handed me a printed ticket, her touch cold but ordinary. "Sorry, dear," she said, her voice perfectly pleasant. I nearly forgot my purse in the car. Senior moment, you know. I took the ticket with shaking hands, checked her name against the manifest, Dorothy Sinclair, age 77, Houghton resident, and waved her aboard. She walked past me, trailing the scent of old lavender and something else, something organic and rotting like vegetation dredged from a lake bottom. I told myself I'd imagined it, lack of sleep, stress, trauma responses. All the things the psychiatric evaluation had warned me about. I almost convinced myself too until that night. My shift ended at 2200 hours. We were docked in Houghton. The passengers disembarked hours earlier. I was performing a final deck check before turning in when I noticed them. Wet footprints on the deck outside cabin 4 where Dorothy Sinclair had been assigned. Footprints leading from the cabin door to the starboard railing, then back again. Then to the railing again, back to the door. Over and over, an endless loop worn into a trail of water on the deck. I followed them with my flashlight, my heart rate climbing. The cabin door was closed. According to the manifest, Mrs. Sinclair had disembarked at 17:30 hours, walking down the gangway with the other passengers. I'd watched her go. I'd checked her cabin myself after she left, standard procedure to ensure nothing was left behind or damaged. The footprints were fresh, water still pooled in each impression, not yet evaporated. I knelt and touched the water, bringing my fingers to my nose. The smell hit me like a physical blow. Deep lake water, certainly, but also something ancient and wrong. Rotting vegetation, yes, but vegetation from impossible depths, from places where photosynthesis had never occurred, where plants grew in absolute darkness and fed on things that sank and never surfaced. There was a mineral quality to it too, like rust and copper, and something that might have been blood if blood could ferment for decades in cold, lightless pressure. Rule number 13. If you find wet footprints leading nowhere, do not follow them backward. I stood up quickly, backing away from the cabin door. The footprints led to the railing, I reminded myself. Not nowhere. They led to the railing where Mrs. Sinclair could have stood looking at the water before... Before what? Before returning to a cabin she'd already left? Before walking back and forth a dozen times, dripping lake water she should never have been wet with? I returned to crew quarters without reporting the footprints. I told myself I'd been mistaken about the time, about having checked the cabin. I told myself a lot of things that night. But I also took the laminated card from my pocket and read rule number 3 again. And this time I didn't think it was hazing. The next morning the footprints were gone. The deck was bone dry as if nothing had happened. I might have convinced myself I'd imagined it, except for one thing. When I performed my routine inspection of cabin 4, I found a button on the floor beside the bed. A horn button, vintage, from a 1940s coat. It was covered in something that looked like algae and smelled like the deepest part of the lake. I threw it overboard before anyone could see, and I tried not to think about whether I'd just violated rule number 9. My bunkmate was Derek Cassidy, a deckhand who'd worked the Manitou's Crossing for 2 seasons. At 23, he had the kind of confidence that comes from having never truly failed at anything important. He was competent at his job, popular with the occasional passengers, and openly contemptuous of what he called maritime ghost stories. "It's brilliant, actually," he told me during our 3rd crossing together, showing me his phone. He'd created a TikTok account dedicated to mocking the ferry's rules. "Horror content performs amazing on the algorithm. I've got almost 15,000 followers already." His videos showed him deliberately violating minor rules while making exaggerated, scared faces, whistling on deck after dark, bringing a photo of his family on board. Each video had captions like, "Still alive," and "Superstition is for suckers." The comments were full of people calling him brave, encouraging him to test the creepier ones. I didn't tell him about Mrs. Sinclair's footprints. I didn't tell him about the button I'd thrown overboard or about how I'd started sleeping with the laminated rules card under my pillow. I especially didn't tell him that I'd begun to notice things, little things, that didn't feel right. Shadows that moved against the direction of the light. Passengers who appeared in different clothes between boarding and disembarking. The way the ship's bell occasionally swayed in the breezeless cargo hold, as if something had brushed against it. "You're buying into the cult," Derek said when he caught me reading the rules card during a break. "Hendricks has everyone so spooked that you're all gaslighting yourselves into seeing shit." "Maybe," I said, but I didn't believe it anymore. The night Derek died, though we wouldn't know for 3 days that he'd died, we were running a midnight crossing. This was unusual. Normally our schedule kept us to daylight and early evening runs. But a medical researcher on Isle Royale had equipment failures that threatened temperature-sensitive samples, and we'd been contracted for an emergency supply run. The fog rolled in 20 minutes after we left port. Not gradually, but like a curtain falling, thick and gray and cold. Within minutes, visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. Captain Hendricks reduced speed to a crawl and ordered all crew to their stations. That's when we heard the singing. It started so quietly that I thought it was the wind through the superstructure, or perhaps the engine producing a harmonic resonance. But then it resolved into something clearly melodic, a woman's voice, coming from somewhere below deck, singing in a language I didn't recognize. The melody was beautiful in the way that dangerous things can be beautiful. It had the quality of a lullaby, but there was something wrong with the rhythm, with the intervals between notes. It sounded like music transcribed by someone who'd heard it from underwater. The acoustic properties distorted and strange. "What the fuck is that?" Derek appeared from the stern, his phone already out, already recording. "Tell me you hear that." "Derek, don't," I started, but he was already moving toward the sound. Rule number 8. If you hear singing beneath the deck at night, plug your ears immediately. I grabbed foam earplugs from the emergency supplies and shoved them in my ears, the action automatic, drilled into me by weeks of reading and rereading the rules. The singing became muffled but didn't disappear entirely. I could still feel it somehow, like a vibration in my chest. Through the muffled silence, I watched Derek follow the singing toward the cargo hold access. He was narrating to his phone, his mouth moving excitedly. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could imagine. Finally, some real spooky shit on the Manitou's crossing. Let's see what's making that sound. I tried to grab his arm to stop him, but he shook me off, laughing. He thought this was content. He thought this was mythology he could debunk for his followers. The singing grew louder as he descended into the cargo hold. Even through the earplugs, I could hear it intensifying, becoming more insistent, more complex. The melody began to layer, one voice becoming many, harmonizing in ways that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. Derek disappeared through the hatch, his phone light bobbing in the darkness below. I stood there, my hands pressed against my foam-plugged ears, counting seconds. Maritime protocol said I should follow, should ensure crew safety. Every instinct I had as a trained sailor said I should go after him. But rule number 8 was absolute. Plug your ears immediately. Not go investigate, not rescue anyone who doesn't. Immediately plug your ears, and presumably stay where you were. I stayed. The singing continued for 17 minutes. I watched the clock in the wheelhouse, counting every second. Then abruptly it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I found Derek 20 minutes later, standing in the cargo hold in ice-cold water that had somehow flooded the sealed compartment. The water reached his knees, and it shouldn't have been there at all. The cargo hold was watertight, inspected and certified. There were no leaks, no breaches, no way for that much water to have entered. Derek stood perfectly still, facing the hull, his eyes open and unblinking. His phone was still recording in his hand, held just above the waterline. His lips were moving soundlessly, and as I approached, I saw water pouring from his mouth in a steady stream, as if he were a fountain, as if the lake itself had filled him and was using his body as a conduit. He was singing the same song, though no sound emerged, just water, cold and dark, flowing from his mouth and nose and eyes. "Derek!" I grabbed his shoulder, and he was cold, so cold like his body temperature had dropped 40 degrees. He didn't respond to my voice, didn't acknowledge my presence. His lips just kept moving in the same pattern, singing in silence, water streaming down his chin. I ran for Captain Hendricks. By the time we returned with the first mate and emergency equipment, Derek had stopped producing water. He stood in the same position, breathing shallowly, his eyes still open but unseeing. We pulled him from the cargo hold. The water had mysteriously drained, leaving the floor dry except for his wet footprints, and laid him on the deck. Captain Hendricks checked his vitals with the expression of someone who already knew what she'd find. "He followed it," she said quietly, not looking at me. "He followed it, and now it has him." We radioed ahead for emergency medical services. When we reached Houghton, paramedics were waiting at the dock. Derek walked off the boat under his own power, his movements mechanical and precise. He walked down the gangway, across the terminal parking lot, and directly into Lake Superior. He walked into the water at exactly 3:17 hours in full view of 6 witnesses, including 2 paramedics, Captain Hendricks, myself, and 2 terminal security officers. He didn't run. He didn't hesitate. He simply walked at a steady pace until the water closed over his head, and then he kept walking, his silhouette visible for another 30 seconds as he descended the steep underwater shelf near the dock. The Coast Guard dive team searched for 3 days. They brought in sonar, underwater cameras, specialized recovery equipment. Lake Superior is the deepest of the Great Lakes, with a maximum depth of 132 feet, and it's cold enough to preserve bodies indefinitely. They should have found him. They found nothing. No body, no evidence of where he'd gone after he walked off that underwater shelf. They did recover his phone a week later, washed up on a beach 40 miles north of Houghton. It was still recording, even though the battery should have died days earlier. The footage showed Derek walking along the lake bottom deeper and deeper for 47 hours straight. The camera captured the moment when the sunlight from the surface faded completely, and he continued into absolute darkness. In the final frames, lit only by the phone's dying flashlight, you could see other figures walking alongside him in the darkness. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The Coast Guard gave the phone to me, though they kept copies of the footage for their investigation. They ruled Derek's death accidental drowning with possible psychiatric factors, which was their way of saying they couldn't explain it and didn't want to try. I keep the phone in a waterproof case in my cabin. Sometimes, late at night, it still turns on by itself and plays videos I didn't record. Videos shot from beneath the Manitou's crossing as we pass overhead, the hull visible through dark water and me on deck going about my duties while Derek's drowned followers count the crossings, waiting for the next person who doesn't plug their ears. Rule number 8 isn't a suggestion. It's the only thing standing between you and walking into water so deep and cold that your body will never stop moving, never stop serving the thing that sings below. Derek learned that. I just wish he'd learned it earlier. The Coast Guard confined me to the ferry during their investigation. Standard procedure, they said. I was a material witness and they needed me available for follow-up questions. In practice, it meant I lived on the Manitou's crossing for 11 days while investigators reviewed footage, interviewed crew, and tried to make sense of Derek's death in ways that would fit their forms and protocols. I'd never felt simultaneously so trapped and so vulnerable. The ferry was docked. Her engines quiet, but she still moved with the water, a subtle rocking that made sleep difficult. At night, I'd hear the ship settle and creak, and I couldn't stop wondering if those were normal sounds or if something was testing the hull. Patient and methodical, waiting for the next crossing. On the fourth day, unable to sleep and desperate for anything to occupy my mind that wasn't Derek walking into the lake, I began exploring the crew quarters more thoroughly. Most of the cabins were sparse, utilitarian bunks with minimal personal effects. Captain Hendrix's cabin was locked. The first mate's cabin contained nautical charts and an impressive collection of maritime law textbooks. It was in the supply closet at the end of the corridor that I found the navigation trunk. It was old, constructed from wood and brass in a style that predated modern waterproof plastic storage. Someone had shoved it behind boxes of life jackets and emergency flares, hidden but not locked. The trunk's lid was covered in stickers from maritime unions and ferry services dating back decades. Inside were logbooks, dozens of them. The oldest was dated 1923, its pages yellowed and brittle, written in careful fountain pen script. The handwriting was beautiful, almost calligraphic, recording passenger manifests, weather conditions, and maintenance notes. It took me a moment to realize what I was reading. These were logs from the original Manitou's Crossing, a ferry that had operated this route before the current vessel. I pulled out more logbooks, arranging them chronologically on the floor of my cabin. There were gaps, years missing, some books damaged by water, but the record was clear. The Manitou's Crossing was at least the fifth ferry to bear that name. The others had all sank in Lake Superior under circumstances the official reports called mysterious. The first Manitou's Crossing went down in 1934 with all hands lost. The second in 1947, same outcome. The third in 1961, the fourth in 1985, though this one had a single survivor. Captain Hendrix's predecessor, a man named Eugene Marsh, who was pulled from the water after 16 hours and died 3 days later in the hospital, having never regained consciousness. Each logbook contained rules, not always 15, some had 12, others had 19, but the core instructions remained consistent across decades in different hands. Never look directly at passengers without luggage. Do not retrieve anything that falls overboard. If you hear singing below deck, plug your ears immediately. Some rules had annotations, desperate scrawls in margins that official logbooks shouldn't contain. From 1929. The woman in the gray dress appears on every crossing now. She boards at Houghton. She never disembarks at Isle Royale. We've stopped adding her to the manifest. From 1943. We lost Morrison last night. He went to retrieve his wedding ring that fell overboard. We saw him reach the water. We didn't see what pulled him under, but it was fast and it took him whole. Found his ring on deck this morning, perfectly dry. From 1958. The captain says the rules are not protection, they're appeasement. We're not following safety protocols. We're paying tribute every time we cross. Every violated rule is a payment we can't afford. I found a logbook from 1973 authored by a deckhand named Thomas Ouellet. His entries started professional and deteriorated across 3 months into something between confession and warning. He wrote about passengers who weren't there when the manifest was checked, crew members who disappeared during crossings only to be seen later standing on distant ice floes watching the ferry pass. He described equipment failures that resolved themselves without explanation, compasses that spun counterclockwise for exactly 3 minutes during certain crossings, and the sound of footsteps on deck when everyone was accounted for below. But it was Thomas's final entries that made my hands shake as I read them. June 14, 1973. I saw them tonight. The drowned congregation, Captain Reese calls them. During dead calm, when the fog came in and we followed rule number 1 perfectly, I kept my eyes forward like instructed. But the deck was covered in water that hadn't been there before, and in the reflections I saw them standing on the surface of the lake all around us. Hundreds of them. Men in voyageur clothing from the 1700s. Sailors in uniforms from every decade. Women in dresses from eras I couldn't identify. Children. So many children. All of them with water pouring from their mouths, their eyes black from lid to lid, staring up at the ferry like we were the ones who were dead and they were the ones still living. June 18th, 1973. Spoke with an Ojibwe elder in Houghton who wouldn't give his name but knew about the ferry. He said the lake has a memory like the earth has a memory. Geological. Permanent. Every person who dies in it becomes part of that memory. European settlers brought their own dead when they colonized these waters. Shipwrecks, murders, drownings, suicides. The lake collected them all. Now there's something down there that's not alive but not gone either. The spirits of indigenous peoples who knew these waters mixed with the ghosts of Europeans who disrespected them, all of it compressed by depth and cold and time into something new. Something hungry. Something that maintains rules we didn't negotiate because the alternative is worse. June 22nd, 1973. Captain Reese let me read the original rules, the ones the first Manitou's crossing captain wrote in 1903. They weren't rules back then. They were observations. Passengers sometimes board who we cannot later account for. Objects that fall overboard occasionally return. Singing can be heard from below, especially during fog. The rules came later after the captains realized these observations had patterns. After they realized the anomalies increased when certain actions were taken. The rules aren't protection. They're a treaty we didn't negotiate. Every crossing is a trespass. The rules are how we apologize. June 30th, 1973. This is my last entry. I'm transferring to the mainland dock services. I can't do another crossing. Last night during my watch, I heard my sister's voice calling from the water. Marie died when she was 7, drowned in a pool in Detroit, 300 miles from here. She never saw Lake Superior, but she was out there last night. I'd swear it on everything. Calling my name, asking me to come swim with her. I almost went. I was at the railing, one leg over, when the first mate found me. Rule number 11. Never acknowledge anyone who calls your name in a voice you recognize unless you can see them. I knew the rule. I was following the rule. But I almost went anyway because it sounded so much like her, and I've missed her for 20 years. The lake remembers everything it takes, and it wants more. If you're reading this, you're probably assigned to the Manitou's crossing. I'm sorry, follow the rules. Don't ask why they work. Don't try to understand, just follow them. And maybe you'll survive long enough to warn whoever comes after you. That was Thomas Ouellet's last entry. I searched the subsequent logbooks and found a notation from July 1973. Deckhand Thomas Ouellet transferred to shore duties per his request, replaced by Deckhand Martin Keohane. I found Martin Keohane's death notice 3 logbooks later. He'd walked off the ferry in December 1973 during a crossing and was never seen again. I sat on the floor of my cabin, surrounded by decades of warnings written by people who'd tried to survive this route, and I finally let myself acknowledge what I'd been avoiding since the night Derek died. I was trapped in something much older and more patient than I could comprehend. The rules weren't hazing. They weren't superstition. They were the only documented method of surviving repeated contact with something that existed in the spaces between normal reality and impossible horror. That night I heard Michael's voice for the first time since his death. It came from outside my cabin porthole, from the water, even though we were docked and there was no one in the water. His voice, exactly as I remembered it, speaking my name. "Sarah, Sarah, please, I'm so cold, I've been waiting. Why won't you come?" Rule number 11. Never acknowledge anyone who calls your name in a voice you recognize unless you can see them. I closed my eyes and covered my ears and recited the rules in my head like a prayer. All 15 of them over and over until his voice finally faded. But I knew it would be back. The lake had taken Michael 6 months ago, and now it was using him as bait. I'd survived his death once. I wasn't sure I could survive hearing him drown again night after night for however long I stayed on this ferry. Captain Hendricks found me on the bridge during the late-night watch, 11 days after Derek's death. I'd volunteered for the 2200-600 shift because I couldn't sleep anyway, and the bridge felt safer than my cabin. At least here I could see the entire deck, could track any movement, could remind myself that the voices from the water weren't real even though they sounded exactly like Michael. She arrived without announcement, moving with the quiet competence of someone who'd spent more time on water than land. She carried 2 mugs of coffee, both steaming in the cold air. March in the Upper Peninsula was still bitter, and the bridge heater struggled against the chill that came off the lake. "You've been reading the old log books," she said, handing me a mug. It wasn't a question. I found them in the supply closet, the navigation trunk. I didn't apologize. I'd violated no explicit rule by reading them. "Good. Better you understand what you're dealing with." She stood beside me at the observation window, looking out at the dark water. The ferry was still docked, but the lake was restless tonight, small waves slapping against the hull with irregular rhythm. "How long have you been captain?" I asked. 27 years on the Manitou's Crossing, 34 years total on Superior." She sipped her coffee. "I'm the only crew member who's worked this route for more than 3 years. The only one still alive, anyway." The weight of that statement settled between us. 73 people, she continued, her voice quiet and matter-of-fact. "I've seen 73 people taken by this lake on my watch. Some violated rules knowingly, like Derek. Most didn't know there was anything to violate. They just made mistakes. Ordinary human mistakes that happen to cost everything when you're trespassing on something ancient and territorial." "Why do you stay?" I asked. "Why keep crossing?" "Because someone has to. Because this route has been operating in some form since the 1800s, and stopping wouldn't make the lake any less hungry. It would just mean the next captain would start from nothing, learning the rules through death instead of documentation." She turned to look at me directly for the first time since I'd met her. I knew the rules would claim Derek the moment he pulled out that phone to record. I could have stopped him. I could have ordered him to plug his ears, could have physically prevented him from going below deck, but that's not how this works. "What do you mean?" "The lake makes choices, Sarah. Not random choices, deliberate ones. Derek was marked from his first day on this ferry because he came here with disrespect. He thought the rules were superstition. He mocked them publicly. The lake is patient, but it's not forgiving. It waited until the perfect moment, fog, midnight, singing below deck, and it collected what it was owed." She paused, watching my reaction. "You're wondering if you could have saved him. You couldn't. Once someone is marked, once they've violated the treaty, intervention just spreads the debt. You try to save them, and now you're both owed." I thought of Thomas Ouellet's entries of his sister calling from the lake. How does it choose? How does it know? The indigenous Ojibwe called this Gitche Gumi, big seawater. Their oral traditions talk about it having consciousness, having preference. European settlers brought their own beliefs, their own dead, their own anger and violence. All of it sank into water that's so deep and so cold that nothing ever truly decays. Bodies are preserved here for decades. Ships sit on the bottom, essentially unchanged. She gestured at the dark water beyond the bridge. Imagine that much death, that much trauma, that much human ending, all preserved in freezing darkness. Now imagine it developing awareness. Not intelligence like we understand it, but something more fundamental. Hunger, memory, arithmetic. Arithmetic? Counting, Sarah. The lake counts debts. Every ship that crosses is a trespass, but it's an allowable trespass if you pay proper respect. The rules are how we pay. Follow them perfectly and your crossing is balanced. Violate them and you've taken more than you've given. The lake eventually collects. She pulled down her collar, showing me the scar on her throat. I'd noticed it during our first meeting, but had quickly learned not to ask. Rule number 15. Now she was volunteering the information, and I understood that meant something significant. 30 years ago, I was first mate on this ferry. Different captain then, man named Eugene Marsh. I'd been working the route for 3 years and thought I understood the rules. One winter crossing, we had dead calm. Proper procedure, everyone following rule number 1 perfectly. Except I thought I saw something in the water, looked like a child drowning. My daughter was 7 years old at the time, and the figure looked exactly like her. I violated rule number 1. I looked over the railing. She touched the scar, tracing it with her finger. Something came up out of the water so fast I barely saw it. Pale arms, dozens of them, like 100 people grabbing at once. They pulled me overboard before anyone could react. I went under, and it was... She stopped, searching for words. It was like going down into a crowded room. There were people everywhere in the water. Not swimming, just existing. All of them dead. All of them aware. All of them reaching for me. I saw Eugene Marsh down there, even though he was still on the boat. I saw myself down there, drowned, welcoming me home. And then I saw something deeper, something vast, something made of all of them and none of them. It looked at me. What happened? It decided I was worth more alive than dead. I don't know why. Maybe it needs captains who understand, who can teach the rules, who can maintain the treaty. Maybe it just wasn't my time yet. But it made me a deal. Serve or sink. Keep the ferry running, keep the rules enforced, keep the crossings respectful, or the next time I go under, I stay down. She met my eyes. I chose to serve. I've been serving ever since. Now you have the same choice. I don't understand. I haven't violated any rules. No, but you've been claimed anyway. Her voice was gentle, almost sympathetic. You lost someone to this lake 6 months ago. Michael Forrester, age 30, drowned in a boating accident you survived. You don't remember what happened, but the lake does. It took him and let you go, and now it's calling you back. That's why you hear his voice. That's why you ended up on this ferry despite having other options. That's why you'll keep crossing no matter how much it terrifies you. The coffee mug shook in my hands. How do you know about Michael? Because I've seen this pattern before. The lake takes someone, leaves a survivor, and then that survivor ends up working the Manitou's crossing. You're not the first, Sarah. You won't be the last. The lake is patient. It plants hooks and waits years for them to pull. I don't owe it anything. I followed every rule. You don't remember what happened on that boat. You told the Coast Guard you can't recall 47 minutes between Michael going overboard and your distress call. What if you violated a rule you didn't know existed? What if Michael's death was the lake collecting and you've been in debt ever since? I wanted to argue, wanted to insist that there were no rules on that recreational boat, that Michael had simply fallen, that I'd been in shock, that the gaps in my memory were trauma, not guilt. But I thought of Thomas Ouellette's words. The lake remembers everything it takes, and it wants more. The Coast Guard investigation clears next week, Captain Hendricks said. You'll be free to leave. You can quit, find another job, another coast, another life. But you'll still hear his voice. You'll still dream of water. You'll still feel the pull. The lake doesn't let go of debts. She finished her coffee and set the mug down. Or you can stay. Learn the rules. Keep crossing. Maybe if you serve long enough, the debt gets forgiven. Maybe it doesn't. But at least you're doing it with eyes open, with support, with documentation that spans a century. That's not a choice. That's a trap. Yes, she agreed. But it's a trap you walked into the moment Michael went overboard, and now you're choosing how you navigate it, blind and alone, or informed and accompanied. She left me alone on the bridge. Outside, the lake continued its restless movement, counting debts, waiting with geological patience for the next payment. I stayed on the bridge until dawn, reading through the laminated rules over and over, trying to see them not as superstition but as survival, not as hazing, but as history, not as restrictions but as respect paid to something vast and hungry that remembered every ship that had ever crossed its surface. When the sun rose, I still didn't have answers, but I knew I wasn't leaving. The lake had already decided. I was just choosing how to serve my sentence. The Coast Guard officially closed their investigation on Derek's death 17 days after he walked into the lake. Accidental drowning with possible psychiatric factors. The report was careful, clinical, avoiding words like unexplained or anomalous. They noted that Derek had exhibited unusual behavior in the hours before his death, that he'd been non-responsive to crew intervention, and that his decision to enter the water was consistent with a dissociative state potentially induced by environmental stressors. They recommended improved mental health screening for crew members and updated safety protocols for night crossings in fog conditions. They didn't mention the singing. They didn't mention the 47 hours of underwater footage. They didn't mention that Derek's body was never recovered despite optimal search conditions and multiple dive teams. I was cleared to return to regular duty. My psychiatric evaluation was scheduled for April 15th, standard procedure following a workplace death and a requirement for reinstating my full maritime certification. Until then, I could work as general crew under provisional clearance. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt the weight of inevitability settling over me like fog. April 7th, during a late afternoon crossing with clear skies and calm water, the radio crackled to life with a distress call. Mayday, Mayday, this is fishing vessel Northern Grace. We're taking on water 12 miles northwest of Passage Island. Engines failed. We have 5 souls on board. Water is rising. Request immediate assistance. Captain Hendricks was off the bridge performing routine inspections. The first mate, a quiet man named Paul Hendricks, her nephew, though they rarely acknowledged the relation, acknowledged the call and began plotting coordinates. Northern Grace, this is Ferry Manitou's Crossing. We copy your mayday. What is your current position? Static then. Manitou's Crossing, our GPS is down. We're approximately 12 miles northwest of Passage Island. Last recorded position 47.97 north, 88.71 west. Paul entered the coordinates into our navigation system and I watched the screen update. The Northern Grace was 16 miles from our current position. At our cruising speed, we could reach them in 40 minutes. It would delay our schedule, but well within acceptable parameters for maritime emergency response. Northern Grace, help is en route. Estimated arrival 40 minutes. Can you confirm number of souls on board and current water ingress rate? 5 souls on board. Water's coming in fast, maybe 18 inches in the hold already. We're trying to bail, but we can't keep up. Paul looked at me. Get the captain. Full emergency protocol. I found Captain Hendricks on the lower deck and relayed the situation. Her expression didn't change, but I saw her grip tighten on the railing. What are the coordinates? I told her. What time did the call come in? 16:47 hours. Current position of the sun? I blinked. Ma'am? Where's the sun, Sarah? I looked west. The sun was descending toward the horizon, maybe 2 hours from sunset. It's late afternoon, Captain. We'd reach them before full dark. No, we wouldn't. Not if we follow maritime safety protocols. We'd need to slow in those waters after dark, account for reduced visibility, ensure proper rescue procedures. We'd arrive at their coordinates at approximately 1845 hours, after dark. Captain, they're sinking. Come with me. She led me to the bridge where Paul was maintaining radio contact with the Northern Grace, reassuring them that help was coming. Captain Hendricks took the radio from him. Northern Grace, this is Captain Hendricks of the Manitou's Crossing. Can you describe the conditions at your location? Heavy seas. No, wait. Actually, it's pretty calm. Fog rolling in, though. Getting thick fast. Can you describe your vessel's current list? Are you taking on waterport or starboard? We're pretty stable. Almost unnaturally stable given how much water we've got down here. Can you see any other vessels in your vicinity? Negative. No vessels visible. Just fog. It's getting really thick. Can barely see the bow from the wheelhouse. Captain Hendricks set down the radio and pulled up maritime records on the bridge computer. She typed quickly, searching historical data. Northern Grace, can you confirm your vessel registration number? MI 7392TN. She turned the computer screen toward me. Maritime Registration Database. Search results for Northern Grace MI 7392TN. Status: sunk date, October 14th, 1998. Location: approximately 12 miles northwest of Passage Island. Cause: hull breach. Weather-related casualties: 5, all souls lost. I felt the deck shift beneath my feet, though the water was calm. Northern Grace, Captain Hendricks said into the radio, her voice steady. We're experiencing mechanical difficulties. I'm radioing the Coast Guard to take over rescue coordination. Manitou's Crossing, we need help now. Water's up to our knees. Coast Guard is better equipped for this rescue. They'll reach you faster. Stand by. She ended the transmission and switched to the Coast Guard frequency, reporting the distress call and our inability to respond due to engine concerns. The Coast Guard acknowledged and dispatched their nearest vessel. I stared at her. We're not going? No. There are 5 people. There are no people, Sarah. There haven't been people at those coordinates since 1998 when the Northern Grace went down with all hands. She pulled out her laminated rules card and pointed to rule number 14. If you encounter people in the water after dark, do not deviate course for rescue. Radio Coast Guard and continue. They're not in the water, they're on a boat. Read the rule again. People in the water after dark. Not people drowning, not people swimming. People in the water, as in, of the water, belonging to it. She switched back to maritime records and pulled up incident reports. The Northern Grace calls in a mayday approximately once every 18 months. Always the same coordinates, always the same conditions: fog, taking on water, 5 souls on board. 3 other vessels have responded over the past 26 years. Only one of those vessels made it back. The crew reported finding nothing at the coordinates except fog so thick they couldn't see their own bow. 2 crew members went missing during that rescue attempt. They stepped onto the deck to prepare rescue equipment and were never seen again. The fog cleared 10 minutes later. What about the vessels that didn't come back? Ferry St. Lawrence, 2003, Supply Vessel Copper Harbor, 2011. Both responded to Northern Grace distress calls. Both disappeared at the same coordinates. No wreckage, no survivors, no bodies. The Coast Guard eventually classified them as lost with all hands. Cause unknown. I looked out at the water. We were still heading toward our original destination, maintaining course and speed. Somewhere 12 miles northwest. The Coast Guard would be racing toward coordinates where 5 dead men had been calling for help for 26 years. We're letting them go into a trap. We're letting the Coast Guard do what they're trained to do. Their vessels have different protections, different protocols. And we're following rule number 14, which is the only thing keeping this ferry and everyone on it from becoming another unrecovered wreck. She put her hand on my shoulder. You want to help. That's good instinct, Sarah. That's the instinct that makes good sailors. But that instinct is exactly what the lake uses. It calls for help. It shows you people who need rescue. It makes you violate rules by appealing to your better nature. And then it takes you. So we just listen to them drown again and again? They're already drowned. They've been drowned for 26 years. What you're hearing is bait, and the lake is very, very good at making the bait believable. The radio crackled again. Manitou's crossing, this is Northern Grace. We're going under. Please God, we're... Captain Hendricks turned off the radio. The bridge fell silent except for the steady thrum of the engines and the sound of water against the hull. I felt sick. I felt like a coward. I felt like I was abandoning people who needed help, even though I knew, intellectually, logically, undeniably from the evidence Captain Hendricks had shown me, that there were no people to help. But God, it sounded real. The fear in their voices sounded real. That night, something began scraping along the ferry's hull, not randomly, methodically, like something was testing for weaknesses, running fingers along the metal, searching for a way in. The sound continued for 6 hours, rhythmic and patient, stopping only when the sun rose. Later, when we docked and I could inspect the hull, I found no damage. But I did find handprints in the morning frost coating the metal. Hundreds of them. Small hands, large hands, children's hands, all pressed against the hull at the waterline, all facing inward as if they'd been trying to push their way onto the boat. That was the night I understood. The lake didn't just take, it used what it took. Those 5 men from the Northern Grace drowned in 1998 were now tools, lures, bait crafted from real tragedy to create more tragedy. An endless cycle of drowning feeding on the instinct to prevent drowning. And I'd almost taken it. I'd almost grabbed a life ring and run to the railing. If Captain Hendricks hadn't stopped me, if she hadn't shown me the records, I would have violated rule numbers 14, trying to save people who were already 26 years dead. The lake knew what I'd lost. It knew I blamed myself for Michael's death. It knew I was desperate to save someone, anyone, to prove I wasn't the coward who froze while her fiancé drowned. And it had nearly used that knowledge to collect its debt. I finally understood why the rules existed. Not to protect us from random dangers, but to protect us from ourselves, from our own compassion weaponized against us. My final scheduled crossing before I could quit came on April 23rd. I'd completed my provisional period. My psychiatric evaluation had gone as well as could be expected. The counselor noted persistent trauma responses and survivor's guilt, but concluded I was fit for continued maritime duty with recommended ongoing therapy. My certification reinstatement was being processed. I could leave after this crossing. Find work on the West Coast. Never see Lake Superior again. I'd submitted my resignation letter 3 days earlier. Captain Hendricks had accepted it without comment, filing it with personnel records as if people quit this job all the time, as if the average tenure wasn't measured in weeks before someone walked off or was taken. The crossing began normally. We departed Houghton at 600 hours with a skeleton crew, just Captain Hendricks, Paul, myself, and an engineer named Rodriguez. We carried 8 passengers and 4 pallets of supplies. The weather report called for clear skies and light winds. The dead calm hit at Orjo 847 hours. I was on deck performing routine inspections when I noticed the wind had stopped. Not died down. Stopped as if someone had flipped a switch. The lake's surface went from small regular waves to absolute stillness in under 30 seconds. The water looked like dark glass, like we were crossing liquid obsidian. Then the fog came. It rolled in from every direction simultaneously, a gray wall that consumed visibility in moments. 1 second I could see the horizon, the next I couldn't see the forward mast. The fog was so thick it had texture, like breathing in cold cotton. The ship's bell rang once from the wheelhouse, Captain Hendricks signaling all crew to stations. Rule number 1. During dead calm, do not look over the railing. Do not respond to anything you hear. Do not leave your station until the fog clears. I moved toward the bridge, following the railing by touch because visibility had dropped to less than 5 feet. My hand came away from the metal wet, though there'd been no rain. The water on my palm was ice cold and smelled wrong, mineral and old and faintly of copper. The bridge was a pocket of relative clarity. Captain Hendricks stood at the wheel, her eyes fixed directly ahead. Paul was at the instruments, though every gauge had stopped working. Our GPS showed us stationary despite the engine continuing at full cruising speed. The compass spun slowly counterclockwise. "We're in it," Captain Hendricks said quietly. "Nobody leaves the bridge. Nobody looks at the windows. Eyes forward." "For how long?" Rodriguez asked, his voice tight. "However long it takes." The voices started 17 minutes later. They came from everywhere and nowhere, from the fog, from the water, from inside the ferry itself, dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, calling names. Paul Hendricks, this is Uncle Eugene. I'm so cold, come help me." Paul's face went white. Eugene Marsh, Captain Hendricks's predecessor, drowned 30 years ago. "Rodriguez, buddy, it's me, Tommy, from engineering school, remember? I fell off that sailboat sophomore year. I've been waiting out here. Come see?" Rodriguez's hands clenched on the console. "Sarah." My heart stopped. Michael's voice, coming from the starboard side, from the water, from everywhere. "Sarah, please, you left me. You let me drown. Why won't you help me? I'm right here. I've been waiting for you. Come swim with me. Come swim with me like we used to." Rule number 11. Never acknowledge anyone who calls your name in a voice you recognize unless you can see them. I kept my eyes on the blank gray fog in front of the bridge window. I didn't respond. I barely breathed. "Sarah, I know you hear me. I can see you through the hull. You look so tired. Don't you want to rest? The water's not cold anymore. It's peaceful. Everyone's here. Derek's here. He says to tell you it wasn't your fault, not plugging his ears. He says to tell you the singing is beautiful once you stop fighting it." The temperature in the bridge dropped. Our breath misted. Frost began forming on the instruments. Through the fog, shapes pressed against the hull. I could see them in my peripheral vision, pale faces, hands, bodies, all trying to board, hundreds of them. The entire drowned congregation that Thomas Ouellette had written about, drawn to the surface during dead calm, pressing against the ferry like moths against a light. "You can't ignore me forever, Sarah. I know what happened that day. I know what you did. I know why you can't remember. You want to remember? Come down here. I'll show you exactly what happened in those 47 minutes." My hands were shaking. I wanted to cover my ears. I wanted to scream at him to shut up, to leave me alone, to stop using Michael's voice because Michael was dead and whatever was speaking wasn't him. But responding was acknowledging. Acknowledging was violating rule number 11. Violating rules during dead calm was... Something massive scraped along the bottom of the hull. The entire ferry shuddered. It felt like we'd run aground, except the depth gauge, when it had been working, showed 300 feet of water beneath us. "Captain?" Paul's voice cracked. "Eyes forward. Don't respond. Don't look down." Captain Hendricks's hands were white-knuckled on the wheel. Her lips were moving in what I realized were prayers, the same Ojibwe prayers she'd mentioned learning from her grandmother. The scraping came again, longer this time, as if something enormous was dragging itself along our keel. The ferry tilted 3 degrees to port, then leveled. Sarah Ann Kellerman. Michael's voice again, but changed now. Colder, multiplied, as if dozens of versions of him were speaking in imperfect unison. You violated the treaty. The day I drowned, you violated terms you didn't know existed. The lake granted you 47 minutes to make payment. You failed. Now the debt comes due. You can pay now quickly, or you can pay later, slowly, watching everyone around you feed the water until you're the last one left and you walk in voluntarily because you can't bear another death on your conscience. Don't listen, Captain Hendricks said. That's not your fiancé. That's not anyone. It's the lake using voices like we use tools. It's trying to collect. Or, the Michael voice continued, you can serve, like Hendricks serves, like every captain has served. Keep crossing. Keep feeding us passengers who violate rules. Keep bringing us trespassers. Become our shepherd, and your debt extends. Decade after decade after decade, you live, but only because you're useful. Only because you're guiding others into our waters. I finally understood what Captain Hendricks had meant. The deal she'd made 30 years ago wasn't mercy. It was employment. She wasn't surviving. She was serving, bringing crossing after crossing through waters that claimed the careless and the unlucky. A ferry captain for the drowned. The scraping became pounding. Something, many somethings were hammering on the hull from below. The sound was deafening, rhythmic, furious. The ferry shook with each impact. They're angry, Paul said. Why are they angry? We're following the rules. Because she's trying to leave, Captain Hendricks looked at me. They know you submitted resignation. They know this is your last crossing. They want to collect before you escape. I can serve, I shouted at the fog. I'll stay. I'll keep crossing. Don't negotiate, Hendricks grabbed my shoulder. Once you offer, they'll twist it into they'll demand more than you mean to give. But it was too late. The voices stopped. The pounding stopped. The fog remained thick and gray and absolute, but the drowned congregation went silent. For 5 minutes there was nothing but the engine's thrum and our panicked breathing. Then Michael's voice returned, singular now, clear. Offer accepted, terms binding. You'll cross these waters until we release you or you join us. You'll maintain the rules. You'll warn but not prevent. You'll watch us collect crossing after crossing, and you'll remember that every death could have been yours instead. Welcome to your extended sentence, Sarah Kellerman. Captain Hendricks will train you well. The fog lifted as suddenly as it had arrived. The wind resumed. The lake returned to its regular motion, waves forming naturally. Our instruments coming back online. The GPS showed us 12 miles off course, drifting near coordinates I recognized immediately. 4597 north, 88.32 west, the exact spot where Michael had drowned 6 months ago. The deck was covered in handprints, not frost this time, actual handprints pressed into the metal as if it were wet clay. They steamed in the morning sun, evaporating slowly, hundreds of them disappearing as we watched. We completed the crossing in silence. The passengers disembarked, none of them aware that anything unusual had happened. To them, it had been a routine trip with slightly delayed arrival due to fog conditions. Captain Hendricks found me on deck after the passengers left. You didn't have to offer. You could have endured it, completed your last crossing, and left. Could I? Really? She didn't answer. The lake already owned me, I said, from the day Michael drowned. I just didn't know the terms until now. I'm sorry. Don't be. You tried to warn me. Thomas Ouellette tried to warn anyone who'd read his log. The rules themselves are warnings. I just didn't understand that some debts can't be paid, only serviced. I looked at the steaming handprints. How long have you been servicing yours? 27 years next month. And you're still here, still crossing. Still alive, she corrected. There's a difference. I stopped living the day I made my deal. Now I'm just maintained, like the ferry itself. Functional, necessary, persistent. I touched one of the fading handprints. It was still cold. What happens if I try to quit anyway? If I just leave? You heard the terms. You can serve or you can join them. There's no door number 3. The last handprint evaporated, leaving the deck clear and ordinary, as if nothing had happened. As if we hadn't just been surrounded by centuries of drowned dead, all of them pressing against the hull, testing for weakness, counting debts. I need to update my resignation letter, I said. I'll help you draft the withdrawal. Captain Hendricks turned toward the bridge. Welcome to the Manitou's Crossing, First Mate Kellerman. Let's hope you last longer than most. I stayed on deck a while longer, watching the sun burn off the last traces of fog, trying to see the lake as I'd seen it when I first arrived. Just water, just geography, just a job. But now I could see what Thomas Ouellette had seen, what every crew member eventually saw if they survived long enough. The lake had memory. It had hunger. It had patience, and it had me. I completed my provisional contract, then another. By June, I'd been promoted to first mate. Paul requested transfer to shore duties after the dead calm incident, though he couldn't articulate why. The official reason was family obligations. The real reason was the same one that drove most crew away. He'd heard his dead uncle's voice and couldn't unhear it. The Coast Guard's investigation into Derek's death closed permanently. Accidental drowning remained the official cause. The 47 hours of underwater footage was classified as anomalous equipment malfunction, though I happened to know one of the investigators quit his job 2 weeks after reviewing it. He moved to Arizona, as far from large bodies of water as possible. The coroner's report on Derek included one detail that didn't make the public record. His lungs were full of water, but the water didn't match Lake Superior's chemical composition. It was older somehow, denser, wrong. The mineral content suggested water that had been sitting undisturbed for centuries, collecting sediment and decay and things that shouldn't exist in water that's been in contact with living ecosystems. The coroner wrote inconclusive in her report and recommended the samples be sent to a specialized lab. The samples mysteriously disappeared in transit. The coroner retired 6 months early. I learned the routines. I memorized not just the 15 official rules, but the dozens of unwritten ones that Captain Hendricks shared during long night watches. I learned which passengers to watch carefully. The ones who boarded without making eye contact, who didn't blink often enough, whose reflections in windows didn't quite match their physical positions. I learned to recognize the difference between ordinary fog and dead calm fog. I learned that certain coordinates should be avoided during certain moon phases, though I never learned why. Mostly I learned to live with the voices. Michael called to me on every crossing now. Sometimes from the water, sometimes from empty cabins. Once, horrifyingly, from my own cabin's mirror at 2 a.m., his voice coming from my reflected mouth as I watched my lips move without my permission. I learned not to respond. I learned not to look. I learned to function while being haunted. To perform my duties while being reminded constantly that I was one violation away from joining the drowned congregation permanently. 3 months after the dead calm incident, I took the ferry back to Houghton on a rare day off, planning to visit the mainland, to feel solid ground beneath my feet, to pretend for a few hours that I was a normal person with a normal job. As I disembarked, Captain Hendricks handed me a laminated card. "Updated rules," she said. "Added a 16th. I looked at the card. 15 familiar rules and a new one at the bottom in handwriting I didn't immediately recognize. 16. The lake always knows who owes it a debt. The handwriting was mine, my exact loops and slants, my specific way of forming letters. But I had no memory of writing it. When did I? You didn't. That appeared on my copy 3 days after dead calm. Checked the other crew copies. Same thing. Rule 16 in your handwriting on every card. I stared at the rule. My rule. Written by me without my knowledge, added to documentation that stretched back decades. A warning from myself to myself. The lake is accepting your service, Captain Hendricks said. This is how it marks its employees. Every long-term crew member eventually contributes a rule. Mine was rule number 15, added 26 years ago after I tried to ask the captain at the time about his scars. That didn't go well. What happened? He walked off the ferry mid-crossing and we never saw him again. The rule appeared on my card the next day. Never ask the captain about his scars. I've been captain ever since. I read my rule again. The lake always knows who owes it a debt. It wasn't a rule, really. It was a statement of fact, a warning, a reminder that everything happening to me, Michael's death, my arrival on this ferry, my deal during dead calm, my continuing servitude, wasn't random. It was accounting. The lake kept books, and I was a line item that hadn't been balanced. That night in my apartment in Houghton, the one I barely used anymore since I spent most nights on the ferry, I tried to remember Michael's accident. I tried to push past the white static that filled those 47 minutes, to understand what violation had condemned me. I remembered the morning. Michael and I taking a recreational boat out on the lake, just a few miles offshore, for an afternoon together. I remembered the sun and the water and being happy. I remembered Michael going below deck to get drinks. I remembered hearing him call my name, and then static, white noise, 47 minutes of nothing. And then I was radioing for help, alone on the boat, Michael gone, and no memory of the gap. The psychiatrist said it was trauma response. The Coast Guard said it was possible I'd been knocked unconscious briefly. Everyone said it was natural to not remember traumatic events. But now, after months on the Manitou's crossing, after learning the rules, I wondered, what if I'd been following a rule I didn't know existed? What if I'd heard Michael call my name in his voice and I'd responded? Rule number 11. Never acknowledge anyone who calls your name in a voice you recognize unless you can see them. Had Michael called from below deck? Had I responded? Had I violated a rule that existed in these waters regardless of whether there was a laminated card to inform me? And if I had, what had those 47 minutes been? Had I been given a chance to save myself? A grace period to make payment? And had I failed sealing Michael's fate and creating my debt? I would never know. The lake had taken those minutes from me, edited my memory, left me with guilt and obligation and a job I couldn't quit. I returned to the ferry the next morning. Captain Hendricks was waiting. "You'll be training someone new next week," she said. "Another deckhand, kid named Marcus, fresh out of maritime school looking for experience. He seems eager. I'll prepare the orientation materials. Make sure you give him the rules card. Make sure he understands they're not suggestions. What if he doesn't believe? What if he's like Derek? Then you watch him walk into the lake, and you update the crew roster, and you train his replacement." She looked at me with those exhausted eyes that never quite focused on anything. "That's the job now, Sarah. We're not ferry workers, we're shepherds. We guide people across water that wants to keep them, and sometimes we fail. And sometimes the people we fail to save become the voices calling the next passengers." She was right, of course. I'd learned that in the months since dead calm. We weren't transportation workers. We were priests maintaining a treaty we didn't negotiate, in a temple that was also a trap, serving a congregation of the drowned who counted every crossing as trespass and every violation as payment earned. "I'll train him well," I said. "I know you will. That's why the lake chose you. You're a survivor who understands debt. That makes you useful." That was 6 months ago. I'm still here. Still first mate, Still crossing Lake Superior twice a week, maintaining the rules, watching passengers, listening to Michael's voice call from the water and refusing to respond. I'm good at the job now. Efficient, professional. I can spot passengers who aren't quite right. I can predict when dead calm is coming. I can navigate by instinct when the instruments fail and the fog rolls in. Captain Hendricks says I'll make captain myself eventually. When she's served long enough, when the lake decides her debt is balanced or her usefulness has expired, she'll walk into the water like every captain before her. And I'll take the wheel. I'll probably serve for decades. I'll probably add more rules to the card, written in my handwriting without my knowledge, warning future crew about dangers I haven't encountered yet. I'll probably watch dozens more Derek Cassidys walk into the water because they didn't believe, didn't listen, didn't understand that some waters demand respect measured in absolute obedience. And every crossing, I'll hear Michael calling, reminding me that I'm here because I failed him, because I violated a rule I didn't know existed, because the lake granted me 47 minutes to make payment, and I couldn't remember well enough to do it. The lake always knows who owes it a debt, and it always collects. Marcus arrived on a Monday in September. He was 22 years old, fresh-faced, with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from maritime academy training and zero real-world experience in waters that hunger. "This is incredible," he said, looking at the Manitou's crossing with something approaching reverence. "I've studied the history of Great Lakes ferries. The safety record on this route is statistically remarkable given the conditions." I didn't correct him. The safety record he'd studied was carefully curated, omitting the previous 4 vessels that bore the same name, omitting the crew members who'd quit by walking into the lake, omitting the passengers who'd boarded and never disembarked, who existed now in ship manifests but not in official records. "Let me show you around," I said, leading him aboard. The orientation followed the same pattern Captain Hendricks had used with me. Tour of the vessel, review of safety equipment, discussion of weather patterns and navigation challenges, all perfectly normal, perfectly professional. Then I handed him the laminated card. 16 rules now. 15 inherited from decades of drownings and mine at the bottom. A reminder that accounting never stopped. Marcus read through them, his expression shifting from curiosity to confusion to nervous laughter. Is this like a hazing thing? Crew tradition? I didn't smile. I met his eyes directly, the way Captain Hendricks had met mine 10 months ago. And I said the words I'd been taught to say. These are survival. Memorize them. Follow them exactly. Don't test them. Don't mock them. Don't assume they're metaphor or tradition. They're the only reason any of us are still here to have this conversation. But there, he glanced at the card again. Some of these are just urban legend stuff. Never acknowledge anyone who calls your name in a voice you recognize unless you can see them. That's like every creepypasta ever. Creepypasta doesn't explain Derek Cassidy, I said quietly. Who? The deckhand before you. He thought the rules were content for his TikTok. He mocked them publicly. He tested them deliberately. I pulled out my phone, Derek's phone, water-damaged and haunted, and showed Marcus the final frames of the underwater footage. Dozens of pale figures walking in the darkness. This is what happens when you don't follow the rules. Derek is still down there, still walking, still serving the lake in ways the living can't. Marcus stared at the footage, his face draining of color. That's edited. Special effects. The Coast Guard has full copies. You can file a FOIA request if you want. They'll send you the same footage along with their investigation reports classifying it as equipment malfunction because they can't explain it any other way without sounding insane. I pocketed the phone. You'll start seeing things on this job that don't make sense. Passengers who aren't on the manifest. Sounds that don't have sources. Water where water shouldn't be. You'll want explanations. You'll want rational reasons. Instead, you'll have these rules. Follow them and you'll probably survive. Ignore them and you'll become a warning for whoever trains your replacement. He looked at the card again, this time not laughing. This is serious. The most serious thing you'll ever do. The lake has memory. It has hunger. It maintains accounts. The rules are how we maintain our side of a treaty we didn't negotiate. As long as you follow them, you're allowed to cross, violate them, and you become payment. I left him to memorize the rules, to wrestle with whether to believe me, to decide if this job was worth the risk. He stayed. Most did initially. The pay was good, the work was straightforward, and most people couldn't really believe the rules mattered until they saw evidence. I gave it 3 months before Marcus either walked off or walked into the lake. That was the average. In my cabin, I maintained my own records now. A logbook in the tradition of Thomas Ouellette and the dozens of crew members who documented their service before being claimed. I wrote about the passengers who boarded but never disembarked, about the voices that called from the water, about the handprints that appeared on the hull during dead calm. I wrote about Michael, whose voice had become part of the lake's choir, calling me crossing after crossing, reminding me of debt and failure in 47 minutes I couldn't remember. And I wrote about the deal I'd made, the extended sentence I was serving, the countdown that might last decades or might end tomorrow, depending on the lake's arithmetic. Some nights, when I couldn't sleep, I took out Derek's phone. It still turned on occasionally, powered by something that wasn't battery charge. It still showed footage I hadn't recorded, views from beneath the Manitou's crossing as we passed overhead, the hull visible through dark water. And sometimes in those videos I could see myself on deck, going about my duties, checking safety equipment, training new crew members. The footage was shot from below, looking up through hundreds of feet of water, through darkness that should make visibility impossible. But the drowned congregation could see perfectly in their domain. They watched every crossing. They counted every passenger. They waited with geological patience for violations, for payment, for the next person who owed them debt. And in every frame, they were getting closer to the surface, slowly, incrementally. As if decades of crossings had allowed them to rise, as if each ferry that bore the name Manitou's Crossing had lifted them slightly higher, as if eventually they wouldn't need people to walk into the lake. They would simply reach up and pull the ferry down. I never showed these videos to anyone. Not Captain Hendricks, not the Coast Guard, not Marcus. Some knowledge was too heavy to share. Some warnings would only make the job impossible instead of merely terrifying. Instead, I did what Thomas Ouellette had done, what every long-term crew member eventually did. I documented everything. I added to the historical record. I wrote warnings that future crew members might find in forgotten trunks, might read during sleepless nights, might use to survive a few crossings longer than they otherwise would have. And I waited, for the lake to decide my debt was paid, for my usefulness to expire, for the day when I'd hear Michael's voice and finally respond, finally acknowledge, finally violate the rule that had kept me alive this long. Captain Hendricks said it happened eventually to everyone. The need to respond became overwhelming. The guilt became heavier than the survival instinct. The voices became more persuasive than the rules. "You'll know when your time comes," she told me. "You'll feel the pull become irresistible, and you'll walk off the ferry mid-crossing and you'll finally join everyone you failed to save. That's how every captain ends their service. That's how I'll end mine. That's how you'll end yours." She was probably right, but not today. Not this crossing. Today I would maintain the rules, train the new crew, guide the ferry across waters that remembered everything, and add another day to my extended sentence. Today I would serve. Tomorrow the lake would count, and I would cross again. And the drowned congregation would press their pale hands against the hull. And Michael would call my name in the voice I remembered, and I would not respond. Not yet. Not until the lake decided my accounting was complete. And some debts I'd learned take lifetimes to balance.